Steve joined DOE at the Albuquerque Operations Office in 1977 and had a series of jobs there where he ended up really in charge of weapons production and overseeing the entire national security program at Albuquerque Operations Office. Prior to that, he had been a test engineer with the Navy, and he was instrumental in the programmatic EIS, which resulted in non-nuclear reconfiguration, and is going to take us now through the end of the first, as he calls it, the first Cold War, and sort of bring us up to today. Steve?
Yeah, this is about setting Charlie up for success. The template was laid down about 25 years ago, and I'm going to talk mainly focused on the weapons and the effect on the complex for what you have today to manage. Next slide. All right, so before getting into that, you need to understand that we started building the weapons that we have now in 1978. And that's these are the weapons that we're dealing with now. But then between 86 and 96, a whole bunch of things happened in the world and in the US that led to what we have currently now as the nuclear weapon complex and the development of the Stockpile Stewardship and Management Program with the cessation of underground testing. Next. All right, so we built these weapons between 78 and 92 when we stopped, and we did about a baker's dozen of basic new weapon types during that time. 10 were produced and actually went to stockpile. 3 had significant design development investment, but were canceled before they got to production. I did not try to split hairs about mods and alts of weapons because that gets very complicated. Some mods and alts have a significant amount of work associated with them, some don't. You get down into the weeds. But there were basically a baker's dozen worth of weapons, basic weapons that were done during that time. So of the 10 that did make it to stockpile, 7 are currently in the stockpile, and that's what we're dealing with right now. And the other 3 have either been dismantled or waiting or in the process of being dismantled. The total stockpile size during that time was averaged about 23,000 weapons. And that was the case when things started to collapse right in the early 90s. Very importantly, and a surprise to me, because I was planning this at the time, there were still more than 24 basic weapon types in the stockpile at that time. I counted 28 when I was doing it. 28 to me being significant differences, not insignificant differences. So this huge pile of weapons is sitting there, and part of it is still sitting there. Next. So these are the 7 weapon types that you have, 2 on the ICBMs, 2 on the SLBMs, the submarine. Many variations of the B-61 bomb. It used to be sort of a test of a weaponeer if you could do the family tree of all the B-61s, because we had 0s, 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s, an enormous number. And we still have a large number now, which will be consolidated, but it's basically one basic weapon, and the B-83, the higher yield weapon, and an air-launched cruise missile. So those are the 7 basic types that remain today. Next. Now, if you look at what we were doing during that time, and by the way, classification rules used to be fairly straightforward. There were clear stay-out zones. At the end of the Cold War, they abolished, if there was any logic to it at all, they sort of abolished it, so it's hard to really talk about things because they've declassified things in pieces rather than whole. So, but I'll just say that we put more than 23,000 weapons through Pantex in that period between 1978 and 1992. I would estimate that that's new weapons, that's dismantling weapons, that's doing repairs and retrofits, that's doing stockpile surveillance and stockpile surveillance rebuilds of those weapons. I would estimate probably between 25 and 30,000 weapons went through Pantex during that time. So while it looks, if you look at the curve that I'm going to show next, it looks like we didn't do anything in the 1980s. That's really not the case. Dismantlement remarkably almost canceled out new production one for one over the decade, and in the many thousands. And that there were still more than 24 weapon types in the stockpile going into this period. Next. So there's the curve. This is the same blue curve that Ev showed in there. And you can see where the stockpile peaked. And the last number they put out, unclassified, at the end of 2017 was about 3,800 weapons. And that's what's in the DoD stockpile that's accountable. There are other weapons that may or may not have been dismantled yet, but that's the official stockpile. The age curve on there, this became an issue with the cessation of new development and production and the abolition of testing. You could see that the age grows almost year for year after we stop. However, that curve, I don't know how they drew that curve. It's trying to calculate today the age of a weapon is very difficult when you've gone in and modified certain pieces of the weapon. So what are you counting? Is like when you do a 76 LEP, are you considering that a new weapon when it has an old plutonium bit in it? So I wouldn't pay too much attention to the age curve, but obviously a factor of 10 reduction in the stockpile is what's happened. Next. Okay, so a lot of things started happening starting in 1986, and this is like a ball rolling downhill and gathering momentum. Ironically, the Chernobyl accident was the first thing that I saw that had an effect on the weapons, direct effect on the weapons complex. And the fact was the analogy of the Chernobyl reactor to the defense nuclear reactors at Savannah River and Hanford, which did not have containment. The fact that the designs of the reactors were different was sort of lost in all that, but the fact that the US defense reactors didn't have containment vessels on it, whereas the US commercial reactors did, started getting people anxious about accidents, all right? And of course, that led to the shutdown of these things, and that affected the production of new production of new plutonium and tritium. By the late 1980s, it's kind of ironic, but we were sort of a green nuclear weapons industry. We were recycling everything. We had been recycling highly enriched uranium since the 1960s because all of those high-yield bombs that were done in the 50s had lots of highly enriched uranium in them, and the new smaller weapons with lower yields didn't. Since we were going into dismantlement, we could recycle the tritium, and we were also recycling the plutonium from dismantled weapons at Rocky Flats plant. So there was very little need, as you approached the end of the 1980s, there was very little need for these new materials, which again contributes to the tendency to shut things down. But then, most remarkably, Reagan and Gorbachev had started having these serious discussions that you've heard about at Reykjavik about eliminating nuclear weapons. And a number of actions were taken, like the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, which applied to our weapons, battlefield weapons in Europe. And also, we started actually doing joint verification experiments with the Russians. Them attending a shot at Nevada, we attending a shot in Kazakhstan. So this thing was rolling along, and then the Berlin Wall fell, and there was the first steps were in the unification of Germany and then the collapse of the Warsaw Pact. So all this is sort of building momentum for what you see in that decline. In parallel with that, was there an increasing concern about the legacy created, the environmental legacy created by the nuclear weapons complex, which led to the Secretary of Energy forming tiger teams to run around the complex, and also the Defense Nuclear Facility Safety Board that Congress enacted. So all of these things are, kind of coming together. Next. But then, most people think that the treaties actually control nuclear weapons. The treaties control accountable nuclear weapons and launchers. So there's not necessarily a direct effect between the treaty and the number of weapons that exist, okay? And that's legitimate, because what you're really worried about is what would actually, the subs and the planes and the missiles that can throw these things, as opposed to the ones sitting in bunkers. But Bush, I was sitting there planning the 90s, I was director of weapon programs, and I was trying to plan the 90s to take some of the, if you looked at the actual production rates in the 80s, they varied by about a factor of 3, which is a very inefficient way to run a capability-based sort of complex, because once you buy a Pantex, it has a certain inherent capability that you want to maximize. So I was sitting there planning to try to how to level that out better in the 90s with newer weapons. And in the meantime, the wall falls and Bush decides to write off half the stockpile. I went back and did some research into how all that decision was made, and it turns out this was not a long-term deliberative process in what they call the interagency process. Bush and his advisors made that decision, and in 3 speeches wrote off half the stockpile. And at one point I said, if he makes another speech, I'm going to have to build weapons to dismantle weapons. And so it was really going very fast. And in parallel with that, he cancels the development of all new weapon systems. We were building the W-88, which is the last weapon, the newest weapon to be built, and canceled the 89, the 90, and everything else we were thinking about. And when people associate the end of the Cold War, they sort of think of it as the driver, as the big driver being the stopping the nuclear testing. The big driver for the complex is stopping design, development, and production, because that's what most of the people do. If you're at Lawrence Livermore or you're at Los Alamos, a fair fraction of those people are associated with nuclear testing, but the rest of the complex, very little. So that has much bigger effect on the complex than just the stopping of nuclear testing. So then Gorbachev unilaterally reciprocates on dropping the stockpile and throws in a kicker about the moratorium on nuclear testing. Congress put forth legislation to do that. Bush wasn't inclined to do it, but he did go along with it. And so the last underground nuclear test was in 1992 that the US conducted. Also in 1991, you started with the START 1 treaty at that time. And when I look at these treaties, and you can see the numerical changes, but again, those are treaty accountable weapons on launchers. They're not the actual stockpile, but it sets up the vector. And eventually the stockpile comes down by other decisions about force structure, how many submarines you want, how many missiles you want, and holes in the Midwest and things like that. So the treaties sort of provide a vector, but they don't directly control the weapons in the stockpile. Next. So here are all these treaties, and most people would associate what happened with those treaties, and like I just mentioned, that's not particularly the case. It's more of a long-term vector that is set up that eventually the DoD decides what force structure they need. Next. So another thing happened at the time, and this is all the momentum rolling downhill, okay? U.S. political and military establishments agree that the situation in Russia is really dangerous. It was dissolving, and still had lots of nuclear weapons. And in doing I gave part of this talk earlier last year, and I did some research on it. And having been involved with it, I became impressed with the way our government dealt with the threat. And so a lot of things were done, and people were trying to do the right thing, and you don't know directly how much effect that had on what occurred, but there was really a sincere effort in a bipartisan way to reduce this threat. Russia collapsed in December of 1991. I was in Russia with lab people on safe, secure dismantlement in January 1992. Then they started lab-to-lab interactions between the scientists. We're afraid of the brain drain of selling their knowledge to other countries. That later developed in the later 90s in a nuclear cities initiative in the same vein of trying to make sure that the Russians could keep control of this technology. And I actually went back there with Los Alamos to talk about, what I'll talk about next is one of the plants that we closed, how we closed the plant and converted it to civilian use. Next. All right, so even before Stockpile Stewardship and Management Program came about, we did a bunch of things. The first one is I significantly increased the dismantlement rate even ahead of the Bush speeches, because it was that we would get from Washington, we would get the drafts of the president's stockpile paper translated into a production and planning directive. And once I saw that, there was going to be a movement to get rid of some of these class of weapons, it was fairly obvious where it would go. And there was no penalty for planning it at the time. I could increase these rates because we weren't doing certain things. For dismantlement, the key thing is bays and cells at the Pantex facility in Amarillo to take them apart. And surprising again to me, with these 28 or so weapon systems, we still had a few weapon systems that I was surprised we still had from a safety and security point of view. And those were pushed to the front of the queue to get rid of those first and then deal with the others. In 1992, the Secretary of Energy made a decision to close the Rocky Flats plant in Colorado without a plan. Without a plan for the national security interest involved, and without a plan to do it safely. It was amazing. And the government was fortunate that it got out of that, given that it went into it with really bad, it's classically a Harvard case study in bad government, the way that was done. That's putting aside, you may want to close it down, you may have concerns about safety, but you need to do that responsibly. It wasn't. And we were able to, right after that, to transfer the pit surveillance. After all, this is the key component in the weapon. We have tens of thousands of weapons. All the data on what we produced and where we used to do the surveillance on those pits was done at Rocky Flats. And all of a sudden it disappears. We were able, within the space of about a year, to get all the records transferred to Los Alamos and then Livermore for their weapons. And we were able to reestablish pit surveillance at Los Alamos. So at least that was done fairly quickly. In 1993, back in 1990, when we did the dismantlement thing, I was looking at the complex and said, well, we're not going to be able to afford the missions that were at the Mound and Pinellas plants. Most people did not know we had a large non-nuclear side of Rocky Flats that did all of the tritium reservoir production. And that had to be dealt with. There was basically a road running right down the middle of the plant. If you were on one side of the road, you were in the nuclear side. If you were on the other side of the road, you were in the non-nuclear. But those components were critical. So we put together, starting in 1990, we put together a plan to consolidate those to other places. We did that. It was about a $400 million program over 4 years, and it was done on time, on budget. Next. So now, here comes the Stockpile Stewardship and Management Program, circa 1993. We have no new weapons to develop and produce. The W-88 production was truncated in all this kind of rolling downhill, you know, everything's gonna turn out fine, you know, the Cold War is going away. We got rid of underground testing, which in my mind was the final arbiter to verify whether a physics problem existed, and then whether it existed or not, and then whether the fix was gonna work or not. And we observed a zero yield limit. There were other ways to do this. The US chose to do a zero yield. Secretary closed Rocky Flats, no plan for production, surveillance, recycle, and recovery of plutonium. And then Congress is looking for the big peace dividend. There were some in Congress that wanted to drive the defense program's budget in half in 1 year. And so all of these things sort of contributed to, well, the US doesn't disarm by some kind of rational policy. It disarms by budget, is basically how it does it. Next. So we're sitting there in 1993. The enduring stockpile weapons, the ones that I talked to you about, are relatively young. Generally, we were designing for about 20 years plus or minus as the military requirement. The weapons are young. They've just been built, the 7 that I talked about. And almost all, it's not that we didn't make mistakes. There were a number of mistakes built during this period. A few big ones, mostly small ones, but all those birth defects were taken out very quickly, with the exception of one that got stalled and plant shut down later on in the 90s. But basically, the reason the stockpile is safe and reliable today is it was designed safe and reliable, and these birth defects were fixed right away. We were extremely anal retentive about fixing anything that we believed was wrong. There was still a great technical debate about whether, how do we ensure the safety and reliability of stockpile without nuclear testing. Vic Reese came along, right person at the right time. Vic was able to put together, using the laboratories and Albuquerque operations, a stockpile stewardship and management plan that could be articulated in Washington. And it was, he deserves a lot of credit for the leadership that was required to keep this thing together when everything else looks like it's collapsing. But then another oddball is thrown in there. The Secretary of Energy decides that somehow we're supposed to figure out what to do with nuclear weapons by doing a NEPA action. Well, the program had been running for a half century. You know, I mean, yes, you do NEPA, but that's not how you figure out what you need to do. You know, we knew what to do. We were under lawsuit from the National Resources Defense Council to do this kind of environmental impact statement. The person who's the Secretary's Chief of Staff was from the NRDC. And so this was a rather difficult time to negotiate the right way to go about this. And so we did do it, and it established articulated purpose and need, what the alternatives were, what the preferred alternatives, and the Secretary did make a decision. So how did we do that? I told Vic, I said, well, first thing we got to do is talk to DOD and tell them how we're going to support. National guidance at the time was start 2 is baseline, but with a start 1 hedge, because we didn't know what was going to happen. Well, the difference is a factor of 2 or so in the number of weapons that you have to maintain. So we went to I did the briefing at Stratcom for the 4-star and the Secretary. This is what we would need to do to protect that strategy. And so we got past that hurdle, and then we needed a document to go out in public, to explain to the public what the program was all about. So I wrote that beige book, which is about a 20-page book describing what the program was all about, and we handed all that out in advance. And then we had to go, and you could see the number of public meetings that were done on both the scoping of it and also the draft EIS. I did the labs, the DC and Nevada, and my deputy did the production plants. More experience than I really needed doing public meetings, but it is a valuable experience if you want to really understand your program and field questions that come from all directions about it. We got through the process on time, and the final was done on time. The secretary didn't want to sign the record of decision before the election, so that's why you see it in December of 1996. But through that action, I'll explain that we've sort of set the template for what Charlie has to manage now. Next. I'll just show this briefly because I couldn't spell NEPA when I started this, and I never talked to anybody outside fences before the end of the Cold War, but now you're out in public trying to explain the nuclear weapons program. And I found it to be a very valuable exercise because what I figured I had to do is trace actual policy from the Congress and the President and what is said in treaties to what's the purpose of the program, what needs does it generate, what are your proposed actions, and you know, it's a very logical process. The only problem with it in a NEPA format, it doesn't tell you what exactly you are doing. So the next slide, and this is translating starting in the same place and ending up in the same place and actually what you have to do to get there. I found that to be a very valuable exercise, and I wouldn't let the process go forward until I could stand up in public and flip between those two charts to show that there was a logical consistency in what was being done. Next. All right, so what were the decisions? We went with enhanced experimental capability. We didn't have nuclear testing. We always did computation, above ground experiments, simulations. We're just going to have to do that better, all right? And so the National Ignition Facility was in there, and the Contained Firing Facility at Lawrence Livermore. The DART facility and the Atlas facility at Lanell. DART was already in the process during this time under different NEPA actions and also in court, which was another interesting experience. And so it was included in the no action alternative, but nonetheless, it got done. And we had this problem. The laboratories had an enormous number of things that they thought they could do and proposed facilities, advanced hydro facilities, but we couldn't go out and do a long-range analysis on things that we might want. So we told people where we might go, but they were not proposed actions in the environmental impact statement. As far as stockpile management, production capabilities and capacities, we wanted to recapture plutonium pit production capability at Lanell with a small capacity. We did evaluate Savannah River at the time. We had most of everything. We were not trying to make a decision for all time. We were trying to recapture capabilities that didn't exist for the US. And Rocky did some manufacturing processes that Los Alamos did not have. So it was kind of, we had most of the set. If you think about 100 processes to build a plutonium pit, Lanell probably had 80 to 90% of those already in PF4, and we wanted to be able to recapture the lines for the, we didn't have to do every one of the 7 weapon types because some pits are very similar. So you might, a subset of that would cover, you know, our ability to deal with the stockpile and any problems it might have. So that's all we were trying to do, and that's what I was responsible for the record of decision that the secretary signed, and all we were trying to do is recapture that capability at a small capacity. We analyzed the higher production capacity mainly because it was based on some analysis of what could be done in PF4, but mainly to make sure that we had the environmental envelope covered for any waste generation and other things. We knew we didn't need that many pits at the time. Remember, they're all still young, and so they were in good shape. Okay, so now we've got this production complex that dealt with thousands of weapons, and now we're going to reduce to a much smaller size. So the effort was to downsize the remaining. Remember, Rocky was out, Mound was out, Pinellas was out, there was 4 left. We would downsize that accordingly to protect what we thought was our ability to manage the stockpile and fix problems with it. And it was based on start 2 base with a start 1 hedge. By the way, that controlled, that had an influence on whether to downsize or try to do more closures at the time. But again, nobody was very certain of anything. Start 3 wasn't even going to be, Start 2 wasn't even going to be effective to 2003. And we're still sitting back here in the mid-90s. So when we did the analysis, and by the way, we handed all the analysis out in unclassified public documents at the meetings. We dealt with cost, which is not required by NEPA, but we felt that the best path was full disclosure to the extent we could do it. And we gave out all the documents on the analysis of why we chose what we did. We analyzed 3 production rates, 50, 150, and 300. 300 corresponded to the start 2, start 1 hedge. The 150 was like start 2, and 50 was a hypothetical 1,000 weapon case that we invented, because you want to have a low case to see if there's a break point in how you would make the decision based on cost and schedule and things like that. Next. So here's where we are now. The green is what we did. We did the non-nuclear consolidation in an environmental assessment that the Secretary signed with Afonso in 1993. And the blue is the ROD on the SSMPIS, and the red is the latest announcement of a decision to try to do some pit production at Savannah River. That's the really only change in the template that was set down 25 years ago. Next. So the epilogue to this is we were trying to address the most critical problems at the time. The planning horizon was no more than 10 years at best. Once you make this decision, it takes a couple of years to get money to do what you say you're going to do. So the first 5 years is sort of getting ready to do what you're going to do, and we thought it would take another 5 years, for instance, in the pit production area, to get those capabilities restored at Los Alamos. And there was still all this uncertainty whether science-based stockpile stewardship would work, whether the stockpile would age gracefully, and the composition of the stockpile, size and type. This was revisited in 2008 in a supplemental to the Programmatic Environmental Impact Statement. The template was not changed. It's still the one you have today. But nonetheless, there are still many things done between that time and now. Many facilities were built, as you could see there in all the acronyms. DART 2, second axis, the RULAB at Los Alamos, which is the radiological building for low amounts of analysis and things that we do with weapons. Highly enriched uranium storage facility at Y12, the new Kansas City campus for non-nuclear components. So a lot of stuff has been done since then, but the template has not been changed. Next. So what happened with enhanced experimental capabilities, computation and simulation? To me, they continue to move along an evolutionary path for the most part. The one thing that I note that's different that we did not consider back then is the subcritical testing at the Nevada test site, which I think is a really good thing to do. I'm a test engineer by background. I don't trust computer codes and simulations unless I have test data that says what I'm seeing makes sense. And so I think the real key in this program is making sure that we keep doing the experiments that validate the codes and the new codes that we've developed. So when I wrote that beige document, I said in there we're looking for 1,000-fold increase in computing speed over what was the fastest at the time. So that was about 100 gigaflops then. So we were looking for 100 teraflops, and we're now at 100 petaflops. So that's about a 1,000,000-fold increase from where we were in the 90s. Right-sizing the industrial base and reestablishing pit production capability and capacity have proved more elusive. The fact is the weapons have been aging very gracefully, well beyond what you have to be careful about an MC requirement for weapon life, military characteristic that the DoD writes. Some people interpret it that when we do that, we know exactly it's going to last that long. What the right answer is, we don't know of any reason why it won't last that long, which is a different statement. But the fact is, they've been doing very well, and that's led to a very low production workload for the complex. Given the low production workload and the uncertainty about remember, we're still in the mid-90s, where this is going, is it going down to 1 weapon, 1,000 weapons, no weapons? People are reluctant to put money into the complex under those conditions. So that's part of the legacy that Charlie has to deal with today. Next. So where do we go in the 20s? These are the same 7 weapons that I talked about earlier, and the B6112 will replace 4 of the older mods. It's in 6.4 is production engineering, or whatever they call it now, but traditionally it's production engineering leading to a phase 5 first production unit. The 76 just completed. I was the original W76-0 program manager. They've just completed the -1 on a fraction of those that were built back in the late 70s, early 80s. The 78 is scheduled to be replaced by an 87-1 with an FPU around 2030. W80-1 will be replaced by W80-4 with an FPU around 2025. The B83 is in a special case, and I don't know where it ends up and when it ends up there. Maybe the 87 did have. This was the one thing that we knew about. The 87 the problem was known before the end of the Cold War. It got caught up in some technical issues plus the shutdown of Y-12, but eventually did get done in the early 2000s, mostly in the early 2000s. And the W88 is going through a major alt, is in production engineering, headed towards a phase 5 FPU. And so the major challenge in the 2020s will be restoring sufficient production capability and capacity to completely rebuild the necessary weapon types with all new components, including the plutonium pit. And going back to that life curve, in the 2030s, some of the original components in those weapons will be a half-century old. So we need to get on with solving that problem and just not hoping for the best forever. And I'll just show, can you flip to the last slide for the optional slides? This is what I drew in 1995, and the target was 3,507 weapon types. Very close to what I showed you as being where we are right now. And that's it.